The morning I realized I was trapped on my own property started like any other Tuesday. I rolled out of bed around 6:30, pulled on an old flannel shirt, poured myself coffee that was probably stronger than it needed to be, and stepped onto my porch expecting nothing more exciting than a trip into town for fence supplies. Instead, I looked down my driveway and nearly dropped the mug right out of my hand. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was seeing. There was a wall, an actual brick wall, 8 feet tall, maybe higher from where I stood, stretching across the only entrance to my property like somebody had decided overnight that I no longer deserved access to the outside world. I remember standing there blinking into the morning sun, thinking maybe I was still asleep, maybe I'd had too much bourbon the night before, maybe somebody was filming a prank show. But no, the wall was real. The fresh mortar smell was still hanging in the air, and bolted into the center of it was a polished metal sign that read, Authorized Community Improvement Project approved by Cedar Creek Estates Association. I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because sometimes when something is so unbelievably stupid, laughter is the only thing your brain knows how to do. The problem was, I wasn't part of Cedar Creek Estates. Never had been. Never would be. My property sat just outside their development, 10 acres of farmland that had belonged to my family long before anybody ever dreamed of turning the neighboring fields into luxury homes with decorative streetlights and matching mailboxes. My name is Jack Mercer, and the land I lived on wasn't just a place to sleep. It was home in the deepest sense of the word. My Uncle Ray left it to me when he passed away 12 years earlier. Every corner of that property carried a memory. The old barn where we spent summers repairing tractors. The creek where we caught fish and lied about how big they were. The oak tree near the back pasture where my first dog was buried. People who grow up in cities sometimes don't understand that kind of attachment. To them, land is an asset. To me, it was family history written into the dirt, which was exactly why I refused every offer Cedar Creek Estates had made over the years. The trouble started shortly after the development was built. At first, the residents seemed friendly enough. They'd wave from a distance, ask questions about the property, compliment the view. Then came the offers. A representative from the Homeowners Association approached me one afternoon with a number written on a piece of paper. It was more money than I'd ever seen at one time. I thanked him and declined. A few months later, another offer came, bigger this time. Then another. Then another. Every time I said no. The president of the association was a man named Gavin Holloway. Gavin had one of those smiles that somehow felt insulting even when he was trying to be nice. Expensive watch. Expensive truck. Expensive haircut. The kind of guy who believed everything had a price because everything in his life always had. The first few times we met, he acted cordial. Jack, he'd say, you could retire comfortably. Why hold on to all this? I'd usually shrug and tell him the truth. Because it's mine. Over time, his patience started wearing thin. Mine did too. The offers became pressure. The pressure became complaints. Suddenly, residents were reporting my barn for being an eyesore. My tractor was apparently lowering property values. My gravel road was somehow offensive. One woman actually suggested my chickens were creating emotional distress because they were visible from her backyard patio. I wish I were joking. What really bothered them wasn't anything I was doing. It was what I represented. Cedar Creek Estates had built an image of perfection. Every lawn trimmed exactly the same. Every mailbox matching. Every fence approved by committee. Then there was me, living next door in a weathered farmhouse with a rusted pickup truck and a barn older than most of their houses. I was the reminder that the world existed before their development arrived. About a year before the wall appeared, things took a darker turn. Gavin stopped pretending to be friendly. During one community meeting, he cornered me in the parking lot. Eventually, you're going to have to work with us, he said. Growth is coming whether you like it or not. I remember looking at him and saying, funny thing about ownership, Gavin. I don't need permission to keep what's already mine. He didn't like that answer. The months that followed were filled with small annoyances. Survey flags appeared near my property line. Contractors occasionally wandered where they shouldn't have been. Once I caught a landscaping crew cutting several feet onto my side of the boundary. Every incident seemed minor on its own, but together they painted a picture. They weren't trying to buy me anymore. They were trying to wear me down. So when I stood there staring at that massive wall blocking my driveway, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't shocked that someone from Cedar Creek Estates had done it. I was shocked they were reckless enough to actually follow through. I walked the entire length of the structure. The further I went, the more something felt off. The placement wasn't right. The location seemed strange. Eventually, I reached the edge of the old access route connecting my driveway to Hollow Creek Road. And that's when a memory surfaced that changed everything. 5 years earlier, the county had quietly auctioned off a neglected stretch of abandoned roadway. Most people didn't even know it was available. I did. Uncle Ray had told me years before to keep an eye on it, because one day it might matter. So I bought it. Cheap too. Filled out the paperwork, recorded the deed, and never thought much about it again. Standing there beside that wall, I suddenly realized exactly where Cedar Creek Estates had built it. Not on their land. Not on county land. On mine. And at that moment, staring at those fresh bricks glowing in the morning sun, I finally understood something Gavin Holloway didn't. He thought he'd trap me inside my property. In reality, he had just built an $80,000 mistake directly on land he didn't own. And before the week was over, that mistake was about to become the most expensive lesson of his life. Now, if you're expecting me to tell you, I immediately called a lawyer, filed an emergency injunction, and spent the next 6 months buried in paperwork, that's not what happened. The truth is, after I confirmed the property records and pulled out the deed from my filing cabinet, I sat on my porch for nearly an hour drinking coffee and thinking. There are moments in life when somebody hands you an opportunity so perfect that rushing would actually ruin it. This felt like one of those moments. Around noon, I called the county sheriff's office and asked if someone could come take a look at a property dispute. A deputy arrived first, followed by Sheriff Tom Granger, a man I'd known casually for years. Tom wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. He listened, walked the property, examined the wall, and then studied my deed packet. I still remember him scratching his chin and looking from the paperwork back to the bricks. Well, he finally said, "Unless these documents are fake, they built this thing on your property." I nodded. That's what I figured. He stared at the wall another few seconds. "You want us to force removal?" That was the moment the idea fully formed in my head. I smiled. "No, Tom. I think I've got something better." The next 3 days became some of the most entertaining days of my adult life. First, I called my friend Eddie Martinez, who owned a welding company about 20 miles away. Eddie was one of those guys who never asked unnecessary questions. When I told him I needed a gate built, his first response wasn't why, it was how big. Real big, I told him. Big enough that nobody misses it. He laughed and said he'd be there in the morning. By the end of the week, we'd installed a 14-foot livestock gate painted the brightest neon green we could find. The thing looked like it belonged in a cartoon. Then I ordered custom signs. Private road. No trespassing. Access subject to owner approval. We mounted them where every resident entering Cedar Creek Estates would see them. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Years earlier, a local racetrack had shut down outside town. During the liquidation sale, an old toll booth sat abandoned behind a warehouse. Most people would have considered it junk. I considered it destiny. $200 later, it belonged to me. Eddie and I spent an entire Saturday hauling that ridiculous thing onto Old Hollow Road and positioning it directly beside the gate. By Sunday evening, it looked absurd enough to attract attention and official enough to create panic. Monday morning was glorious. I woke before sunrise, poured coffee into a thermos, pulled up a lawn chair beside the booth, and waited. Around 7 o'clock, the first line of vehicles appeared. At first, drivers assumed there had been an accident. Then they saw the gate. Then they saw the signs. Then they saw me sitting there smiling. Within 30 minutes, traffic stretched nearly half a mile down the road. SUVs, luxury pickups, commuter sedans, delivery trucks. Nobody could get in or out without passing directly through property I legally owned. The first resident approached around 7:30. A woman rolled down her window and asked what was happening. I politely handed her a printed notice explaining that unauthorized construction had occurred on private property and access was temporarily subject to review. She read the page twice. "Wait, this road belongs to you." I nodded. Has for 5 years. Her eyes widened. The HOA never told us that. I'm starting to realize they left out quite a few details. By 9 o'clock, my phone was ringing nonstop. Some calls came from confused residents. Some came from angry board members. I ignored most of them. Then Gavin called. The second I answered, he started shouting, "Jack, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I leaned back in my chair, having a pretty peaceful morning. You can't block access to an entire neighborhood. I looked at the massive wall his organization had built. Interesting legal theory. There was a long silence. Then he changed tactics. Look, let's discuss this like adults. Whenever people start a conversation with "let's discuss this like adults," it usually means they're about to suggest something wildly unreasonable. "I'm listening," I said. "Remove the gate." "No." "Take down the signs." "No." "Open the road." "No." His voice hardened. "You're creating liability." I laughed. "Gavin, your people literally build a wall across someone else's property." The call ended shortly afterward. Around lunchtime, he arrived in person. He marched toward me, with 3 board members trailing behind him like nervous interns. I could see frustration written all over their faces. Sweat stains, tight jaws, forced confidence. The kind of body language people wear when they know they're losing control but haven't accepted it yet. Gavin stopped a few feet away. "This is ridiculous." I shrugged. "So is the wall. You know residents need access. You should have thought about that before trespassing." One of the board members stepped forward. "Maybe we can negotiate." "Absolutely," I said. For the first time all morning, they looked hopeful. Then I handed them a fee schedule. Residents, $250 monthly access permit. Guests, $20 per entry. Commercial vehicles, $100 daily access fee. HOA board members, $750 monthly permit. Non négociable. The look on Gavin's face was worth every dollar I'd spent on that toll booth. His cheeks turned red. "You've lost your mind." "No," I said calmly. I found leverage. That afternoon, things became even more interesting because I started releasing information. For nearly a year, I'd been documenting every interaction with Cedar Creek Estates. Emails, letters, property surveys, security camera footage, even drone recordings. One of my hobbies was aerial photography, and purely by coincidence, my drone had captured several days of construction activity while crews built the wall. The footage clearly showed contractors operating beyond HOA property boundaries. It clearly showed equipment crossing onto my land. Most importantly, it showed exactly who authorized the project. I compiled everything. Every photograph, every deed, every survey map, every permit record, every video file. Then I mailed information packets to every homeowner inside Cedar Creek Estates. Not the board, not Gavin, the residents, the people actually paying the dues. The cover letter was simple. I explained that the HOA had spent community funds constructing a barrier on private property they did not own. I attached documentation proving ownership. I included images of the construction process. I explained that multiple opportunities existed to verify boundaries before work began. Then I made a straightforward offer. If the HOA removed the wall, restored the damaged property, reimbursed expenses, and issued a formal public apology, I would consider restoring unrestricted access. Nothing more, nothing less. The reaction was immediate. Within 48 hours, homeowners began contacting me. Not to argue, to apologize. One retired couple told me they had voted against aggressive actions months earlier because they feared the board was becoming obsessed with forcing neighboring landowners out. Another resident confessed she had questioned the wall project during a meeting but was assured everything had been legally reviewed. Several people seemed genuinely embarrassed. Then the financial details leaked. And that's when the real explosion happened. According to records circulating through the neighborhood, the board had spent nearly $80,000 from HOA funds on planning, legal consultations, contractors, materials, landscaping, and construction. $80,000 to build a wall on land they didn't own. The community turned on them overnight. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Residents demanded answers. Board members started blaming one another. Lawyers became involved. And through all of it, I stayed exactly where I was. sitting beside my ridiculous toll booth, watching, waiting, because while Gavin Holloway was busy trying to save his position, another discovery was about to surface, one that would make the entire situation even worse for him. The wall wasn't the only thing his board had authorized without proper approval. And once homeowners started digging through financial records, years of questionable decisions began crawling into the daylight. By the end of the second week, the fight had grown far beyond me, far beyond a road, and far beyond a wall. And standing in the middle of the chaos, Gavin finally realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. He had spent years trying to force a stubborn country neighbor into submission, only to discover he'd accidentally handed that neighbor the keys to his own downfall. The strange thing about watching someone else's empire fall apart is that it rarely happens all at once. In movies, there's usually one dramatic moment, one explosive confrontation, one speech that changes everything. Real life isn't like that. Real life sounds more like angry phone calls, emergency meetings, whispered conversations in driveways, and people suddenly refusing to make eye contact with the guy they supported a month earlier. That's exactly what happened inside Cedar Creek Estates. During the third week, residents began demanding full financial transparency. Homeowners who had never attended a single association meeting suddenly packed community rooms. Questions started flying. Why had so much money been approved? Who verified the property lines? Why were contractors hired before ownership records were confirmed? Why did the board keep pushing legal threats instead of simply talking to me? And perhaps most importantly, why had nobody informed the residents about any of it? Every answer seemed to create three new questions. Gavin tried holding on to control. He gave statements about protecting property values. He talked about community standards. He claimed mistakes had been made in good faith. But the problem was no longer the wall. The wall had become a symbol. People weren't angry about bricks anymore. They were angry because they realized a handful of individuals had been making expensive decisions with everybody else's money while assuming nobody would ever challenge them. One afternoon, Sheriff Granger stopped by my property just to check on things. We stood near the toll booth looking down the road while traffic moved normally through the gate. "Looks like the neighborhood's eating itself alive," he said. I chuckled. "I didn't start that." He grinned. "Nope, you just handed them a flashlight." That might have been the most accurate description of the entire situation. I hadn't created the problem. I simply exposed it. Once people saw what had been happening, they couldn't unsee it. A few days later, Gavin came to see me one last time. The difference between this visit and the previous one was impossible to miss. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. Even his posture looked different. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He stood beside the neon green gate and looked down the road before speaking. "The board voted to remove the wall." I nodded. "Good. Construction starts tomorrow." "Good." He hesitated. "They're preparing reimbursement documents too." "Also good." For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he surprised me. When this started, I really thought you were the problem." I looked at him and smiled slightly. A lot of people do when they don't get their way. He laughed once, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Maybe." Then he extended his hand. After a moment, I shook it. Not because we become friends. Not because everything was forgiven. Sometimes you shake someone's hand simply because the fight is over. The demolition crew arrived the next morning. I sat on my porch with coffee and watched brick after brick come down. It took less than 2 days to erase the structure that had created months of chaos. Funny how quickly bad decisions disappear once people are forced to pay for them. The following week, Gavin officially resigned. Several other board members followed him out the door. New elections were scheduled. Audits were ordered. Policies were rewritten. Residents began focusing on fixing their community instead of controlling everyone around. Then the check arrived. I won't pretend that wasn't satisfying. It covered every document expense. The gate, toll booth, property restoration, damaged grass, survey costs, legal consultations, everything. Included with it was a formal letter acknowledging the unauthorized construction and apologizing for the situation. I read it twice, folded it up, and put it in a drawer. As for the gate, that stayed exactly where it was. Not because I needed revenge. Not because I wanted power. Mostly because after everything that happened, I figured it had earned its place. Over time, the gate became something of a local landmark. People joked about it. Delivery drivers recognized it. Even some Cedar Creek residents eventually laughed about the whole situation. Every now and then somebody would stop and ask if the famous toll booth story was true. I'd usually tell them the same thing. Every word. Looking back now, I don't think the story was ever really about a wall or a road. It was about what happens when people become convinced that money, titles, committees, and authority make them untouchable. The folks running that association spent years assuming they could pressure, intimidate, and outmaneuver a neighbor simply because he lived differently than they did. What they never stopped to consider was that ownership matters. Facts matter. Boundaries matter. And sometimes the quiet guy sitting on the edge of town knows a lot more than he lets on. Even today, there's one question that still divides people whenever this story comes up. Some folks think I should have immediately forced the wall's removal and ended everything before it escalated. Others think the toll booth was the perfect response. Honestly, I can understand both sides. Maybe I could have taken the high road. Maybe I should have. But then again, if I had, the residents never would have learned what their board was doing behind closed doors. The money would have disappeared. The behavior would have continued. And somebody else would have become the next target. So I'm curious what you think. If you woke up one morning and found a giant wall blocking your only way out, built by people who had absolutely no right to touch your property, what would you have done? Would you have called a lawyer and handled it quietly? Would you have demanded immediate removal? Or would you have built a bright neon gate, dropped a toll booth in front of their neighborhood, and given them a lesson they'd never forget? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a little old-fashioned justice. And remember, before you try to control somebody else's future, it might be smart to check who owns the ground you're standing on.